The glass of fresh milk gleamed white as alpine snow in Private Giovanni Rossi's trembling hands. After 2 years of fighting across the scorching deserts of North Africa, after months of meagre rations and brackish water, the 22-year-old soldier from a small village outside Naples could hardly believe what he was tasting. Around him in the mess hall at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, hundreds of fellow Italian prisoners stared in equal amazement at tables laden with foods they had only dreamed about during the brutal campaigns in Libya and Tunisia. Platters of fried chicken steamed in the summer heat, fresh vegetables, butter, white bread soft as clouds, and pitchers of cold milk sat before men who had survived on hardtack and whatever scraps they could scavenge from the desert. It was late summer 1943, and for these soldiers who had marched under Mussolini's banner, believing they were building a new Roman Empire, this moment represented something far more profound than mere sustenance. They were witnessing their first encounter with American abundance, a glimpse into a society so prosperous it could afford to treat its enemies better than Italy had treated its own soldiers. Giovanni had expected brutality when American forces captured his unit near Tunis in May 1943. The propaganda he'd been fed spoke of American barbarism, of a decadent nation that would surely torture and starve its prisoners. What he hadn't expected was to find himself sitting in a clean, well-ventilated barracks in the American Midwest, being offered seconds on dessert by guards who seemed more like farmers than soldiers. The cultural shock was so overwhelming that many prisoners initially refused to eat, convinced that such generosity must hide some sinister motive. Some whispered that the food was drugged, others that it was a trick to make them soft before interrogation. But this story isn't just about milk and fried chicken. It's about what happens when two radically different worldviews collide, when men raised in the poverty of southern Italy's ancient villages encountered the industrial abundance of modern America. When Italian prisoners of war experienced American prison camps during World War II, they weren't just experiencing captivity. They were receiving their first lesson in a way of life that would eventually transform not just Italy, but all of Europe. The year was 1940, and Italy had entered the war alongside Nazi Germany with dreams of empire and glory. Mussolini promised his people that Italy would reclaim its rightful place as a Mediterranean power, that the soft democracies would crumble before fascist might. For many young Italians, especially those from the impoverished south, the military offered the first regular meals they had known. Giuseppe Sant'Angelo, a corporal from Sicily, later recalled that his army rations, meagre as they were, exceeded what his family of 12 could afford back home. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was the reality of an Italy that had never fully industrialized, where ancient farming methods still dominated, where many villages lacked running water or electricity. The fascist regime promised modernization and prosperity, but delivered mostly rhetoric and military adventures the nation could ill afford. By contrast, across the Atlantic, the United States was mobilizing its industrial might on a scale that would have seemed like fantasy to Italian planners. American factories that had pioneered mass production were converting to military purposes with astonishing speed. The same nation that had invented the assembly line, the supermarket, and the chain restaurant was now applying those principles to warfare. But perhaps most remarkably, America was approaching the treatment of prisoners with the same systematic efficiency it applied to everything else. The Geneva Convention provided basic guidelines, but American military planners went far beyond minimum requirements. They understood that healthy, well-fed prisoners required fewer guards, caused fewer problems, and could even contribute to the war effort through labor. As the war in North Africa turned against the Axis powers through 1942 and 1943, thousands of Italian soldiers found themselves in American custody. The desert campaigns had been brutal. Italian forces, poorly equipped and often abandoned by their German allies, had fought with determination born of desperation. Many had subsisted on a single meal per day, their water rations barely sufficient to survive in the scorching heat. Disease ran rampant through their ranks. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Lieutenant Marco Benedetti, captured after the Battle of El Alamein, described watching helplessly as wounded comrades died from infections that simple. Antibiotics could have cured, if only they had any. Following the successful Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, over 51,000 Italian prisoners of war were sent to the United States. The journey to America itself provided the first shocking contrasts. Italian prisoners, accustomed to overcrowded, unsanitary transport ships, found themselves aboard vessels with proper ventilation, medical facilities, and regular meals. Corporal Antonio Ferrara, captured in Tunisia, later wrote to his family about his amazement at being served hot coffee and sandwiches during the Atlantic crossing. "The Americans treated us not like enemies, but like men," he wrote. "They have so much of everything that they can afford to be generous even to those who fought against them." The first groups of Italian prisoners began arriving at American ports, starting in late 1942. As they were transported by train to camps across the country, many experienced their first glimpse of American prosperity. Private Luciano Bianchi, peering through the windows of his train car, couldn't believe the endless farmland, the well-maintained towns, the automobiles that seemed to be everywhere. In Italy, only the wealthy owned cars. Here, even farmers drove trucks. The highways were paved and smooth, not the rutted tracks he knew from home. Even more astounding were the shops and restaurants they glimpsed during stops, establishments full of goods that had long since vanished from Italian stores. But it was upon arrival at the camps themselves that the full magnitude of American abundance became apparent. Camp Atterbury in Indiana received its first Italian prisoners on April 30, 1943, when 767 POWs opened the camp. By late summer, 3,000 Italian servicemen resided there. Similar scenes played out at Camp Clark in Missouri, Camp Monticello in Arkansas, and dozens of other facilities across the country. These camps had been constructed with remarkable speed and efficiency. Each featured rows of sturdy barracks with electricity and heating, modern latrines with hot and cold running water, fully equipped hospitals, and recreational facilities that surpassed anything most Italian soldiers had known in their own military service. The mess halls, in particular, became sites of almost religious revelation for men accustomed to scarcity. Sergeant Paolo Marchetti, assigned to Camp Clark, described his first meal in terms that bordered on the ecstatic. "They gave us meat, real meat, not scraps or gristle, but thick slices of beef. There were potatoes, fresh vegetables, bread with butter, and for dessert, something they called apple pie. I had never tasted anything so sweet and wonderful, and when I thought I could eat no more, they asked if I wanted seconds. Seconds. In the Italian army, we were lucky to get firsts. The abundance extended far beyond food. Italian prisoners received standard-issue American clothing, sturdy boots, warm blankets, and basic toiletries. They had access to medical care that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Dental work, eyeglasses, even minor surgeries were provided free of charge. Private Federico Ricci, who had suffered from an infected tooth for months in Africa, found himself in a modern dental chair within days of arriving at Camp Monticello. "The American dentist used medicine that made the pain disappear completely," he marveled. "In Italy, we simply suffered or had teeth pulled with pliers and wine for comfort." The camps also featured amenities that seemed impossible luxuries to men from rural Italy. Each facility had libraries stocked with books and newspapers, though initially mostly in English. Movie theaters showed Hollywood films weekly. Athletic fields allowed for soccer matches, the universal language that helped bridge cultural divides between prisoners and guards. Some camps even had prisoner-run orchestras and theater groups, supplied with instruments and costumes by the American authorities. The contrast with Italian military life was absolute. In Mussolini's army, soldiers were tools of the state, to be used and discarded as necessary. Entertainment was propaganda, medical care was minimal, and individual comfort was considered weakness. But perhaps nothing symbolized the gulf between the two societies more than the post exchange, or PX, where prisoners could spend the scrip they earned from voluntary labor. These camp stores stocked items that ranged from necessities to small luxuries: cigarettes, chocolate, toiletries, stationery, even musical instruments and art supplies. For men who had come from villages where a single store might serve hundreds of families with a limited selection of basic goods, the PX was like stepping into a palace of consumer plenty. Private Domenico Lombardi spent his first month's earnings on chocolate bars to send to his younger siblings in Italy, knowing they had never tasted such sweetness. The American guards, many of them farmers' sons from the Midwest, initially viewed their Italian charges with suspicion and hostility. These were enemy soldiers who had fought alongside the Nazis, who had killed Allied troops in Africa. But as the weeks passed, something unexpected began to happen. The guards discovered that many Italian prisoners were not the fascist fanatics of propaganda, but young men much like themselves, caught up in forces beyond their control. Language barriers began to break down as Italian Americans in the military served as interpreters and as prisoners picked up basic English through daily interaction. Corporal James Patterson from Iowa, assigned as a guard at Camp Atterbury, later recalled how his attitude shifted. "At first we saw them as the enemy, plain and simple. But then you'd see them getting excited about a soccer game, or carefully writing letters home, or sharing photos of their families, and you realized they were just guys who wanted to go home. When we found out how little they'd had in their own army, how amazed they were by things we took for granted like flush toilets and electric lights, it was hard not to feel sorry for them." This humanization worked both ways. Italian prisoners, initially terrified of their captors, began to see Americans not as the barbarous materialists of fascist propaganda, but as generous, if sometimes naive people who seemed genuinely puzzled by the poverty and deprivation that had driven Italy to war. Lieutenant Alberto Conti, a former schoolteacher from Rome, spent hours discussing politics and philosophy with his guards, many of whom had never met a European before. "They wanted to understand why we had followed Mussolini," he recalled. "I tried to explain about the chaos after the First World War, the poverty, the promise of restored greatness. They listened, but I could see in their eyes that they couldn't really comprehend it. How could they? They had always lived in abundance." The transformation accelerated dramatically after September 8, 1943, when Italy signed an armistice with the Allies and switched sides in the war. Overnight, Italian prisoners went from enemy combatants to potential allies. The American military offered them a choice: remain as prisoners or volunteer for Italian service units, ISUs, that would support the American war effort through non-combat labor. The decision split the prisoner population. Some, particularly ardent fascists and those who felt bound by their oath to Mussolini, refused and were transferred to higher security facilities like Camp Hereford in Texas, where 4,000 Italian officers who refused to renounce fascism spent the remainder of the war. But the vast majority, over 90%, chose to volunteer. For these volunteers, the transformation was remarkable. They traded their POW uniforms for American military clothing, distinguished only by Italy patches on their shoulders. They received wages of $24 per month, with 1/3 paid in cash and the rest in camp scrip. Most importantly, they gained a measure of freedom and dignity that would have been unthinkable under the traditional laws of war. Private Rossi, our milk-drinking soldier from the opening scene, was among those who volunteered. Assigned to work in the camp's kitchen, he found himself preparing the same abundant meals that had so amazed him upon arrival. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a former enemy, trusted with feeding American soldiers and his fellow Italians alike. The work performed by Italian service units was crucial to the American war effort. With millions of American men overseas, labor shortages threatened everything from food production to military logistics. Italian volunteers filled these gaps, working on farms, in factories, at ports and military depots. They loaded ships in Boston Harbor, harvested crops in California, maintained equipment at arsenals across the country. At Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, Italian workers saved the government thousands of dollars through their lumber salvage efforts. At military hospitals, they served as orderlies and maintenance staff, freeing American personnel for overseas duty. But the impact went far beyond economics. For the first time, these Italian soldiers were experiencing American work culture, with its emphasis on efficiency, standardization, and productivity. Sergeant Enzo Moretti, assigned to a depot in New Jersey, marveled at American organizational methods. Everything had a system, he explained. There were charts and schedules and procedures for every task. At first it seemed excessive, but then you saw how much could be accomplished when everyone knew their role and had the proper tools. In Italy, we often worked harder but accomplished less because we lacked organization and resources. The Italian volunteers also gained unprecedented access to American civilian life. On Sundays, groups of 5 were permitted to attend Catholic Mass in nearby towns, always under guard but increasingly trusted. These excursions provided glimpses of American prosperity that military life only hinted at. Supermarkets overflowing with food, department stores stocked with clothing and appliances, movie theaters showing the latest Hollywood productions, soda fountains serving ice cream sundaes. All of it seemed like a dream to men from impoverished Italian villages. The interactions with Italian-American communities proved especially meaningful. In cities like Boston, New York, and San Francisco, Italian-American families eagerly sought contact with the prisoners, hungry for news from the homeland and eager to help fellow Italians. These encounters often began formally, with community groups organizing dinners or cultural events at the camps, but they frequently evolved into genuine friendships. Corporal Salvatore Russo from Palermo found himself essentially adopted by an Italian-American family in Boston who had emigrated from his same village 20 years earlier. Their Sunday dinners together became highlights of his captivity, offering not just familiar food, but a bridge between the Italy he had known and the America he was discovering. These Italian-American families often served as interpreters of American culture, explaining customs and values that puzzled the prisoners. Why did Americans seem to waste so much? How could they be so casual about resources that Italians hoarded carefully? The answers revealed fundamental differences in worldview. America's abundance had created a culture of consumption and disposal, while Italy's scarcity had bred conservation and reuse. Neither was inherently superior, but the American model clearly produced a higher standard of living for ordinary people. The prisoners' observations went beyond material abundance to social and political differences. Private Giuseppe De Luca, working on a farm in Wisconsin, was stunned to discover that his supervisor, who owned hundreds of acres and modern equipment, considered himself middle class. In Italy, such a man would have been among the elite. Even more shocking was the supervisor's son, who spoke casually about his plans for college. Higher education in Italy was reserved for the wealthy and brilliant. Here, it seemed accessible to anyone willing to work for it. The American political system, with its emphasis on individual rights and democratic participation, fascinated prisoners who had known only monarchy and dictatorship. Some camps organized civics classes where volunteers could learn about American government and history. Lieutenant Conti, the former teacher, became an enthusiastic student of American democracy. "I had read about these concepts in university," he said, "but seeing them in practice was different. The guards could criticize President Roosevelt freely, without fear. Newspapers printed different opinions. Even we prisoners had rights that were respected. It made me think about what Italy could become after the war. Not all experiences were positive, of course. Some Americans remained hostile to the Italian prisoners, especially those who had lost loved ones in the war. There were incidents of discrimination and violence, though these were relatively rare and usually punished by authorities. Some guards treated the Italians with contempt, viewing them as cowards who had surrendered too easily. The Italian volunteers sometimes faced resentment from American workers who saw them as taking jobs or working for unfairly low wages. Within the Italian prisoner community, tensions existed between those who had volunteered for service units and the non-cooperators who remained loyal to fascism. The volunteers were sometimes branded as traitors by their former comrades, leading to fights and disciplinary problems. The American authorities generally handled these conflicts by separating the groups, sending non-cooperators to isolated camps where they spent the remainder of the war. Despite these challenges, the overall experience of Italian prisoners in American camps was overwhelmingly positive, especially compared to the fate of Allied prisoners in Axis camps or Soviet prisoners in German hands. The Geneva Convention's requirements were not just met, but exceeded. Even non-cooperating prisoners received adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The contrast with conditions in Italy became even starker as news filtered in about the German occupation of northern Italy after the armistice, the brutal repression of Italian civilians, and the desperate conditions in Italian cities under Allied bombing. Letters from home, when they arrived, often reinforced the prisoners' growing appreciation for their circumstances. Families wrote of hunger, bombing raids, German brutality, and partisan warfare. Prisoners who had initially felt shame at their captivity began to realize they were perhaps the lucky ones. Private Tommaso Esposito received a letter from his mother in Naples describing how the family was surviving on bread made from sawdust and chestnuts. That same day, he ate beef stew, green beans, and chocolate cake in the camp mess hall. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the growing understanding that Italy had been fighting a war it could never win against an enemy with virtually unlimited resources. As 1944 progressed and Allied forces pushed up the Italian peninsula, the prisoners' work took on new urgency and meaning. They were no longer just filling labor shortages, but actively contributing to the liberation of their homeland. Italian service unit members at ports along the eastern seaboard loaded supplies bound for the Italian campaign. Those working in agriculture helped feed the armies that were freeing Italian cities. The psychological impact was profound. Men who had felt like failures as soldiers could now take pride in supporting their country's liberation. The Italian prisoners built a small chapel at Camp Atterbury in 1943, using surplus materials and mixing dyes from berries and plants to paint religious murals. This chapel in the meadow became a symbol of their faith and their gratitude. Using leftover brick and stucco, they created a humble but beautiful space measuring just 11 by 16 feet. They painted the Eye of God on the ceiling, images of the Madonna and saints on the walls, and made the altar appear to be marble through clever painting techniques. The chapel still stands today as one of the few remaining structures from the POW era. The approaching end of the war in Europe brought mixed emotions. Most prisoners desperately wanted to go home, to reunite with families they hadn't seen in years. But many also worried about what they would find. Letters and news reports painted a picture of a devastated Italy, its cities bombed, its economy shattered, its society torn apart by civil war between fascists and partisans. Some prisoners had learned that their homes were destroyed, their families displaced or dead. America, for all its strangeness, had become a refuge from the chaos consuming their homeland. Moreover, many had developed genuine attachments to their temporary home. Some had fallen in love with Italian-American girls and were exploring ways to remain in America. Others had learned modern farming techniques or business methods they hoped to apply in Italy. Some had absorbed American democratic ideals they believed could help rebuild Italian society. Even those eager to return carried with them ideas and experiences that would influence Italy's post-war development. The repatriation process began in September 1945, with Italian service unit members receiving priority over other prisoners. The farewell scenes at camps across America were often emotional. Guards and prisoners who had started as enemies exchanged addresses and promises to write. Italian-American families who had befriended prisoners prepared packages of food and clothing for the journey home. At the New York port of embarkation, the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was converted to carry 1,247 Italians home to Naples in November 1945, with ISU soldiers allowed to carry 100 pounds of personal belongings compared to the standard 55 pounds for regular POWs. The voyage back to Italy provided time for reflection on all they had experienced. Ships that had brought them to America as defeated enemies now carried them home as men transformed by their encounter with American abundance and generosity. Many spent the journey discussing how to apply what they had learned to Italy's reconstruction. The naive fascist dreams of empire through conquest had been replaced by practical visions of prosperity through productivity and democracy. The first sight of Italy's devastated ports drove home how much their homeland needed the lessons they carried. Private Rossi, clutching a bag of chocolate bars and canned goods given by American friends, stared at the ruins of Naples harbor. The contrast with the bustling American ports he had known was heartbreaking. But he and his fellow returnees were determined to help rebuild, armed with knowledge and experiences their countrymen could hardly imagine. In the years that followed, many former prisoners became bridges between Italian and American culture. Some returned to the United States as immigrants, sponsored by families they had met during captivity, or taking advantage of special provisions for those who had served in Italian service units. Others started businesses in Italy based on American models they had observed. Several became educators, sharing their insights about American democracy and economic methods. A few entered politics, advocating for the Atlantic alliance that would bind Italy to the United States throughout the Cold War. The transformation of Italy in the post-war decades owed much to American aid and influence, but also to the thousands of former prisoners who had experienced American life firsthand. When Italian factories adopted assembly line methods, when supermarkets appeared in Italian cities, when democracy took root in Italian soil, the seeds planted in American prison camps bore fruit. The men who had marveled at abundance in places like Camp Atterbury and Camp Clark helped create their own version of prosperity, adapted to Italian culture but inspired by American example. The Italian service units contributed over 1 million hours of labor to the American war effort, saving the government an estimated $230 million. But the real value of their service went far beyond economics. They had helped forge a friendship between former enemies that would endure for generations. They had demonstrated that generosity could conquer more effectively than armies, that treating enemies with dignity could transform them into allies. Today, the story of Italian prisoners of war in America is largely forgotten, overshadowed by more dramatic narratives of combat and resistance. The camps have been demolished, their locations marked only by historical plaques, if at all. The chapel in the meadow at Camp Atterbury stands as one of the few physical reminders of this remarkable chapter in history. But in towns across America and Italy, elderly men still remember the unexpected generosity that transformed enemies into friends, prisoners into students of a new way of life. Their children and grandchildren, living in a prosperous, democratic Italy allied with the United States, are the ultimate testament to that transformation. The glass of milk that trembled in Giovanni Rossi's hands in 1943 was more than a beverage. It was a symbol of possibility, a taste of a world where abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, where former enemies could be treated with dignity, where prosperity came not from conquest, but from productivity. That first sip of American generosity sent ripples across an ocean and through generations, helping to reshape not just individual lives, but entire nations. The prisoners who couldn't believe American abundance in POW camps discovered something more valuable than material goods. They discovered that a different kind of society was possible, one built on plenty rather than scarcity, inclusion rather than exclusion, hope rather than fear. In the end, American generosity conquered more thoroughly than fascist armies ever could, winning not just a war, but the peace that followed.